Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for joining today's panel discussion on reentry policy barriers to education and employment in Louisiana. My name is Erica Nelson, and I'm the project manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. At the Justice Center, I oversee initiatives focused on bridging and integrating best practices from corrections, reentry, and workforce development fields to reduce recidivism and increase the economic mobility of people returning to communities from incarceration. This includes the development of the strategic direction for the creation of resources and technical assistance for employment-focused reentry programs. I am excited and pleased to have with us today Scott Payton, the Louisiana State Director for Right on Crime. Scott has over 12 years of work experience with the state of Louisiana. Prior to joining Right on Crime, he worked in adult probation and parole as a specialist, supervising people convicted of violent crimes. Scott has spent time as a volunteer and as a reserve deputy sheriff and a correctional officer. He has witnessed firsthand the need for criminal justice reform and the impacts of rehabilitative and reentry programs and the inner workings of the Louisiana probation and parole system. Scott graduated from Louisiana State University at Shreveport with a master's in nonprofit administration from the Louisiana State University, and also received a BS in criminal justice from the University of Southwestern Louisiana. I'm also pleased that Dr. Amy Campbell is joining us for this important discussion. Dr. Campbell is the Executive Director of Student Services at the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. She is an experienced leader in education and training, enrollment management, and financial aid. Under her guidance, she successfully implemented multiple financial aid initiatives that use state dollars to increase enrollment for adult students, as well as manage the creation and implementation of enrollment management support team, and was instrumental in implementing an integrated student information system that encompasses both credit and non-credit students. She is the current chair of the Education Subcommittee for the Louisiana PRI Statewide Implementation Steering Team and a member of the Pell Restoration Working Group with the National Association of Financial Aid Administrators. Dr. Amy Campbell holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Criminal Justice, a Master's degree in Public Administration, and a Doctor of Education from the University of Memphis. I'm also pleased to have my colleague Josh Gaines join us for today's discussion. Josh is a project manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center Criminal Records Project. Josh focuses on issues involving the collateral consequences of conviction, barriers to work, and relief from long-term impacts of criminal records. He previously served as the Deputy Director of the Collateral Consequences Resource Center and provided counsel for federal pardon applicants. Josh received his BA in sociology from the North Carolina State University and his JD from the Washington College of Law at American University. This web meeting is brought to you today as a part of the Return for Good initiative with the support of Louisiana Department of Public Safety and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Today's meeting will begin with a presentation followed by a panel discussion. You can ask questions at any point in time, and we encourage you to use the chat function within this Zoom webinar. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Josh Gaines, to facilitate a presentation on reentry policy barriers to education and employment in Louisiana.
Thank you, Erica. I'm just going to share my screen here so that we can see the slides. And Erica, you can let me know if that's showing up okay.
It's showing up okay.
Excellent. All right. So recently, the CSG Justice Center, in partnership with the DSPC, undertook an evaluation of barriers to employment and education that are imposed by state policy in Louisiana. And just to provide a little bit of context for the discussion that we're going to have here, I wanted to share some of the background information and sort of key findings that came out of that study. So first of all, when we're talking about those policy-based barriers, another way we say it is structural barriers to employment. And those are legal limitations that either allow or require disqualification of workers with criminal records. In Louisiana, these are imposed by regulations and by state statute. There are over 800 provisions of law in Louisiana that impose these structural barriers on employment opportunities. And these employment barriers work in three ways, really. They can either be direct limitations on employers hiring or retaining workers with certain convictions, limitations on occupational or professional licensure, which people must have to perform certain jobs, and then limitations on business licensure, which are necessary for self-employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. Those are particularly important for returning citizens who often have difficulty finding jobs working for other people. It's important that they have the ability to make their own path, and often business licensure is necessary for them to do that. You can see here a brief breakdown of sort of the number of these barriers imposed by Louisiana law and kind of where they fall in terms of all of these. I'll just note that the employment category here, the direct employment hiring and retention barriers, are a bit inflated just because Louisiana tends to have a lot of barriers on very specific public employment positions at the parish level, for example. So I would, on balance, rate occupational licensure as being an issue that is pretty much on par with direct employment barriers in the state. So how do these barriers operate? Well, we found that in Louisiana, 55% of the barriers are mandatory. That means they have to be imposed if a person has a disqualifying conviction. And they have to be imposed regardless of the relationship between a person's offense and the job that they're going to be doing, or evidence of rehabilitation or consideration of any other relevant factors for that matter. In addition to that, we found that most barriers persist indefinitely, 68%. That means that a person is going to be subject to them for life, most likely, unless relief is provided through expungement, a waiver, or some other mechanism. Only 32% of the employment barriers in the state are time limited. And when we say time limited, this is something like, you may be denied a nursing license for a conviction within the past 10 years. Those sorts of time limited restrictions are comparatively rare in the state. We also took a look at the types of offenses that give rise to these sorts of employment barriers. We found that any felony at all can result in over 550 of these provisions of law being triggered. Below that, we have crimes involving fraud or dishonesty. And then we found that there are 200 plus provisions that can be triggered by any crime at all, whether a felony or a misdemeanor. And then below that, you see some other things, crimes of violence and sex offenses, controlled substances offenses, and then other categories below that. Other categories, these are generally very niche kind of regulatory crimes and that sort of thing. But I think the point here is that, a felony of any kind can present significant challenges as far as overcoming these legal barriers go. We also took a look at the fields and the sectors and industries impacted. It really just kind of runs the board, particularly as far as licensed occupations and professions go. Having said that, the most licensed occupations and professions in Louisiana and every other state are those in the healthcare industry. And so it's not surprising that jobs in the healthcare industry are by far the most impacted by structural barriers in Louisiana. There are over 241 regulatory or statutory barriers to healthcare employment or licensure that are imposed by state law. On the other hand, we talk about what kind of jobs people can do when they have these convictions. And it's very important to keep an eye on that, as well as what the barriers are, because they're not all encompassing. So there are very few that apply directly to trades and mechanical and engineering professions, for example. And there are few that apply to the transportation industry. However, there are significant barriers that may affect people working in these industries based on where they work, not necessarily what they do. So that's important to keep in mind as well. And to dig a little deeper into those place-based restrictions, the first big one in Louisiana is that there's a mandatory bar on working in a healthcare facility for life for anyone convicted of a long list of crimes, which you can see in this box over here to the right, if you can make that out. You can see some things that make some good sense, you could argue. First-degree murder, cruelty to the infirmed, exploitation of the infirmed, things like that. But also on that list are a number of offenses that may not relate to public risk in the context of working at a healthcare facility, particularly after a long period of time has passed since the person has been convicted. Among those are a number of controlled substance offenses, which you can see listed there at the bottom. Arson, extortion, things like that. So this is a very, very hard wall for people looking to work in health facilities with these convictions. The other is there's a broad mandatory barrier for people working in school or childcare facilities in any capacity. This generally applies to violent offenses or sexual offenses. And there are also two really important federal barriers to keep in mind, and these are not imposed by state law, but I hopefully we'll have the chance to talk a little bit more when we get to the discussion about sort of the effect that this has, at the base level apart from the federal law itself. But just to provide, an overview of those now, there's a mandatory 10-year bar on employment at an airport, depending on the access that you have to certain parts of the airport. Like I said, that's federal, that's administered by the Transportation Security Administration. There's also a waiver required if you are convicted of a large number of offenses. Waiver required to work in a seaport facility or on a vessel. That's the TWIC card requirement. That's a federal requirement. And again, that is supposed to be access-based. So it's only supposed to apply to workers with access to certain secure areas. And what we've heard, and I think we might hear some more about this, is maybe the degree to which that access-based barrier has been kind of enlarged as a practical matter from the employer's perspectives. Also important to note that in spite of all of these barriers, Louisiana law does a number of things that sort of mitigates their impact to various degrees. One is there's fair chance state employment, where basically if you are seeking a job working for the state, there are a number of factors that the state must consider when considering your conviction. There is a fair chance and provisional licensing provision meant to encourage licensure of people with convictions. However, there are enormous loopholes. It doesn't apply to a long, long list of about 20 licensing bodies. And there are no standards in place for consideration other than that there has to be a direct relationship between the offense and the occupation. But what that relationship has to be is really not defined, and there's no guidance there. There are also negligent hiring protections that are meant to encourage employers, private employers, hiring people with records. It shields them to a degree from liability for anything that a worker might do on the job, which is actually pretty significant. We know that a lot of the reluctance to hire people with records in the private space is born from fears about risks of litigation or liability. And there's also Louisiana's expungement law, which is really pretty good as compared to the other states. Many offenses are eligible. Waiting periods are not short, but they're not as long as we see in some comparable states, especially when we're talking about felony convictions. However, what you get with expungement is a bit unclear. You get your record, essentially hidden from public view, but there are no real limitations on who can ask about the record. If someone knows about that record, whether they can take adverse employment action or licensing action based on that record. So there's certainly some room to investigate solutions there. And really with all of these, there's significant opportunities to improve the scope and effectiveness of each of these policies based on models from other states. A lot of states have taken steps recently in all 4 of these areas and some others. And so I think there's a lot to learn there. We also looked at policy barriers to post-secondary education as part of this analysis. And we came away with some good news, which is there really aren't many that are imposed by statute or regulation. And in fact, Louisiana is pretty unique among the states. They're one of the first and still one of the only states that has banned the box for public college admissions. Now that doesn't, and when I say ban the box, I should clarify, institutions are not allowed to ask on an application about a person's criminal history, right? Private institutions are excluded from that ban the box policy though, so that can certainly be an issue there. Once you have, gotten sort of past that first step of application, the admission process can consider criminal conviction. And this is really significant in certain programs in the healthcare field or others where criminal history is used to screen out applicants who may not actually be able to complete the course requirements because perhaps they might not be able to participate in clinical work or other work-based study programs that are a requirement. And I think we'll certainly hear some more about all of this in our discussion. And that is it for me. And I look forward to talking about this and hopefully we can dig into some of these specifics more. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. Very insightful to hear about, what is happening in Louisiana currently with regards to policies and access to education and employment and, where there's potential opportunities for, advancement. So I'm really excited to talk with, folks in Louisiana who are seeing this work happen on the ground and understanding the dynamics of what Josh has shared with us. I want to start with Scott. Scott, can you tell us about your agency and the strategies that are utilized to increase access to work and careers, particularly for people with criminal records?
I sure can, and thank you, Erica and CSG for having me on, and the Department of Corrections for all their hard work on addressing reentry and getting this information out to not just the general public, but the individuals that are working, as you say, in the trenches. Every time we learn something new or get additional information that we can find helpful. Right on Crime is the national campaign of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we're in partnership with American Conservative Union Foundation and Prison Fellowship. We support conservative solutions for reducing crime, restoring victims, reforming offenders, and ultimately lowering taxpayer costs. The movement was born in Texas in 2007, and in recent years, dozens of states such as Georgia, Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Louisiana have led the way in implementing conservative criminal justice reform. And to increase access to work and careers for people with criminal records, Right on Crime partnered with Recidiviz, which is an organization that came out of Google, researchers from Google, to publish employment opportunities for justice-involved individuals. This report highlights the effects of unemployment on Louisiana families, the Louisiana economy, and the state's budget. One of the highlights from the report was the annual loss in Louisiana's GDP is 4.5 billion if people released from prisons or jails are not hired. And nationally, that's 87 billion is the estimate. So reducing recidivism through the expansion of employment opportunities could also amount to an $11 million savings to the state alone. Nearly 59,000 Louisiana families could be helped if employers hired people with criminal backgrounds. And a few years ago, Right on Crime published a handbook that serves as a great resource for employers considering hiring people with criminal backgrounds. And this past year, we hosted a virtual employer forum series, which highlighted the employment and reentry successes of two women, but also the difficulties they faced attempting to secure employment. One of these ladies, Miss Patricia Williams, served 10 years for theft, and she recounts the stigma of a criminal conviction, how it closed doors to many employment opportunities. She said that too often she was considered the perfect candidate for a job until the employer learned about her criminal background. Ms. Williams challenges employers to look past the mistakes of the past, focus on the individual's qualifications and their skills. Eventually, Goodwill Industries hired Ms. Williams, and today she oversees reentry programs throughout North Louisiana. Another individual we had and highlighted was Tiffany Noreca. She shared her story, and she described the process of securing employment as the biggest hurdle she faced after serving nearly 4 years in prison. She took advantage of every skill program available inside a prison, and yet she met with rejection in her job searches. But one thing that sticks out in particular about Tiffany is her persistence. She refused to fail, and that helped her overcome this barrier. And in my decade of work with probation and parole, Tiffany would be the exception. Most people, and understandably so, are so discouraged by the barriers and the thought that this is a lifelong stigma that they can't overcome. And quite, frankly, they give up very early on. But despite these challenges for Tiffany, she balanced raising her children. She found a job that provided a livable wage, and she was able to secure her real estate license here in Louisiana, which is an extremely incredible feat. And I don't think she would have accomplished that without her persistence. Right on Crime and me personally have played an active role in supporting the clean slate legislation. And you mentioned our expungement process, and it is complicated, it's confusing, and it is a little more inclusive than some other states, but being able to navigate that is difficult. Our clean slate legislation that is pending this session provides an opportunities for persons who have been involved in the criminal justice system to navigate this process. By enacting clean slate legislation in Louisiana, we can remove the barriers for those who have served their sentences and then provide them an opportunity to thrive. And this is more important more than ever now in the wake of COVID-19 to ensure that Louisianians with criminal records aren't left behind as our economy reopens. And we stress in the employer handbook some guidelines for employers to follow when looking at the criminal conviction. And what Clean Slate does, it does that for you. It goes through the offenses that are already in statute. It's not going to change them. It makes sure that there has been a cleansing period or a time that has elapsed where there's been no criminal activity, no new arrest, and then it automatically, or as the law states, it's a government-initiated expungement process, and it's 10 years for felonies, 5 years for misdemeanors. And this will give an added security for employers to know that these offenses have already been vetted through the legislature, and now it's a process that makes it more available to the 1 in 3 Louisianians that have criminal records.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's so good to hear just the work that Right on Crime has been able to, push forward and push through with regards to ensuring that people who have records have access, to employment opportunities. And I love that you are not only looking at it from, state level policy and legislation that needs to take place, but how you establish buy-in and support from employers, because they are key in getting folks to work and being able to excel in work. And it's really good to hear that you all are having forums with employers to kind of talk to them about how important their role is in ensuring that folks get to work. That it's good for their business, and then it's also good for those who are in Louisiana, all citizens of Louisiana, regardless of their criminal background. So thank you so much for sharing that information. Now I want to maybe turn it over and take a look at on the education side, because as we know, in order to access employment, training is key. Making sure that folks have the education and training in order to be competitive and thrive in today's workforce is so important. And we often look to our education institutions to prepare folks for careers that are growing in our regions and within the states. So I want to turn a question to Dr. Campbell and ask the same question that I asked of Scott, and that is to share a bit about your agency that you work with and the strategies that are utilized to increase access to work and careers, and particularly for people with criminal records.
Okay.
There you go, Amy, you're on.
Sorry, I think. Okay, I was just making sure. All right. So again, thank you guys for coming this morning. So the Louisiana Community and Technical College System, we serve as a management board for 12 public two-year institutions. And our mission at LCTCS is to identify and meet the educational and workforce needs of our community through innovative, accessible, and dynamic programs. I like to think that we offer 3 different paths for students. So we have your credit, your traditional associate degree technical diploma training. We have non-credit or workforce training. And then we also have adult education, adult basic education. And in 2019, we served over 160,000 students, about 80,000 students on the credit side of the house, 39,000 for workforce, and over 41,000 students in the adult basic education arena. We've had a long-standing relationship with Louisiana Department of Corrections in providing education to individuals who are particularly incarcerated, but also trying to further that relationship and building on how we can help those reentering. Education and training opportunities are often provided at the cost of the college, or it can be paid for through other mechanisms. So at the local level, colleges can access the federal Pell Grant, but then at the state level, there may be an opportunities to utilize Second Chance Pell. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about the extension of Second Chance Pell and the removal of the ban for Pell Grant for incarcerated individuals, but we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in a little while. I think one of the most important areas that we have focused on in the last couple of years was just removing barriers for students as a whole as a part of the admissions application. I think traditionally admissions to colleges, you want a high school diploma, you want transcripts and things like that. And we've made several policy changes where we have said we don't need that information. So to increase those education opportunities, we do not require a high school diploma for anyone who wants to come into our educational opportunities. Now, that may play into those very specific types of programs like your healthcare programs, but initial admissions to our institution, really you just have to turn in an application and meet some state statute requirements. We've also held several different pilot programs with the state kind of to target the adult population. So using some grant funding and some like through the LOSPA student aid program to utilize some of our GO grant funding to target educational programs, particularly short-term educational programs to the adult population. And students who access our educational opportunities while in prison have access to certain different programs such as credit and non-credit, so those workforce short-term type of programs. And when they complete their work, they are given an actual transcript at the end. So when they're released, they're going to get, it's an unofficial transcript, but that at least helps them try to bridge the gap from leaving prison and then re-entering into the community so that they can maybe connect with their local community college to continue their education. We also know that when, individuals who are being released from prison, that there is a need for immediate income. We want them to be able to have a funding source to be able to support their families and themselves. And especially, in light of, COVID, we've really tried to target the increased use of short-term training programs. We, as soon as kind of COVID hit, we hit the ground running trying to figure out what are short-term programs that we can, train individuals in a small amount of time to get them to work. And so we really increased and ramped up our offerings in that short-term program space. And so that short-term programming can lead to industry-based credentials in high-demand occupations in their region. So think of, healthcare, for example, like CNAs, patient care technicians, trying to get those individuals quick and easy training so that they can go get into the workforce. We also embarked on a new initiative called Reboot Your Career. So we utilized the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund through the CARES Act, and we established this funding pot called Reboot Your Career, and it helped to assist over 5,000 Louisianans who needed to be reconnected to the workforce. And this included individuals who are re-entering their communities through incarceration. So one example in particular, and one of our most successful programs was the work that Louisiana Delta Community College did with the Ouachita Correctional Center. They offered 4 specific credentials in first aid, OSHA training, forklift, and NCCER core. This was at no cost to the college or the prison because we used those Reboot funds to fund that. And now those individuals, when they are released, they have 4 credentials under their belt at no cost. And so now I think our gap is really trying to now connect those individuals with employers who will now employ them with those credentials. So again, we've done lots of work. We're really passionate about, educating the individuals in Louisiana. And we are really excited to be focusing on how we can really increase our partnership with Louisiana Department of Corrections and educating the individuals who are currently incarcerated and the individuals, who are re-entering our communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cable. And I saw someone put in the chat that they want to get training, and where could they go for more information?
Yeah, absolutely. If you would like to chat me your contact information, I can definitely put you into contact with someone. The Reboot Your Career is specific to the institution. So every college has different training opportunities. I will say that we are coming to the end of those Reboot dollars. However, we are hoping to reinvigorate that with some additional CARES funding. We have more HERF money, I think, than we know what to do with right now. So we're hoping to use those dollars and extend the Reboot Your Career initiative and make it even more robust than it is today. So please feel free to shoot me your information in the chat and I will definitely get you connected.
Awesome, awesome. And it's so good to hear about the relationship and partnership between education institutions and, Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections. It is key to ensure as folks who are re-entering, again, have the education and training that they need to connect to today's workforce. I mean, it was really good hearing like how you guys have lowered barriers. A lot of times for folks who are entering correctional systems, they may have not had a chance to achieve their high school diploma or GED. And although, you know, the Department of Corrections provides services in these areas, we find across the country, in terms of accessibility and capacity to provide everyone who has a given need can be a bit of a challenge. So again, just good to hear that that's one barrier that folks don't need to worry about in terms of accessing some training programs that could lead to certifications and you know, those stackable credentials and things that we know are truly important to connect today's workforce. So thank you again for that. I want to turn it over to my colleague Josh to share more about, you know, what the Justice Center is doing as a part of this work in this area. We work with Louisiana, but we've worked with other states across the country. So it'd be really, just really good to hear, as the agency, Council State Governments Justice Center, you know, what is it? How do they do the work that they do to improve economic opportunity and mobility for people with criminal records?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. So here at the CSG Justice Center, we've kind of worked in two tiers on this this area. One is sort of the big high level 50 state view, and we've spent a number of years sort of looking at practices in the states across the country, identifying best practices, allowing states to see what other states are doing and where they're innovating. And the other is of that side of that is sort of digging into individual states when we have the opportunity to do it. And we're really grateful to have had that opportunity here in Louisiana, working with the department, and we're doing that with some other states to help them, you know, get a better understanding of what they look like in the national context, and help them, you know, to develop targeted solutions to policy priorities that they've identified as far as removing barriers to education and work. So this year we produced a report, After the Sentence, More Consequences. It's a national report that looks at the barriers people with criminal records face to accessing work. This is very much based on the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, which is a 50-state searchable index of all of the provisions of state statutes and regulations that impose these sorts of barriers. So we really dug into those numbers, dug into those statutes, and tried to create a real high-level analysis. It provides both a national picture. We have 50 individual state snapshots that demonstrate how many barriers are there, what types and fields they impact, how long they last, and what sorts of convictions trigger them. And that's where most of that information that I discussed in the presentation earlier came from. We also released a companion piece called the Playbook for all 50 states. And this is really sort of, we identified general best practices across the country for how states have been dealing with barriers to work. And then we sort of looked at each state's policy in the context of those specific best practices and tell each state sort of where they are and hopefully give them a better idea of where they could move forward on these issues and what other states they can learn from. Recognizing that many communities don't have the resources to provide reentry and workforce development services for everyone leaving prison or jail and who are on community supervision. The Justice Center, in collaboration with expert practitioners and researchers, BJA, the Annie Casey Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Labor, and with no small amount of work from our moderator, Erica Nelson, developed the Reentry and Employment Strategies Framework. The framework helps policymakers, administrators, and practitioners in corrections, reentry, and workforce development collectively determine whether resources are focused on the right people, using the right interventions at the right time, and it identifies successful strategies for integrating best and promising practices in corrections and workforce development systems All of this to reduce recidivism and improve employment outcomes. And we've been providing technical assistance to states across the country to actually get them to implement this framework on the ground and develop additional tools to assist agencies aligning their reentry and employment programs with these best practices. We've also done some work on the education front fairly recently. We have looked at, adult reentry, juvenile justice, and school discipline, but we really dug into this barrier issue with a grant from the Lumina Foundation. We conducted a 50-state policy scan on access to post-secondary education for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, including statutory and administrative policies and practices that may impact access, model, and innovative policies and opportunities for state level policy change. And then we published the results of that in a report called Laying the Groundwork, How States Can Improve Access to Continued Education for People in the Criminal Justice System. As I'm saying all of this, I'm noticing that we have this lovely chat window with all of these links in it. So I will do my best to get all of those resources I mentioned linked over in the chat if you're interested.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's always good to hear the amount of effort that is happening at a national level to improve this work and how states like Louisiana can tap into some resources to understand more where they fall with regards to policy barriers, and then also identifying what we know around what works to improve outcomes and how to implement models that are research driven, such as the integrated reentry employment strategies framework. That was an awful plug for the work that I work on, but again, I think it's a great resource, as well as the other resources we have posted in the chat box. I saw a question about, whether as people who are releasing from the prison system, whether or not they're able to obtain identification. And there is a response with regard to that. Louisiana Department of Corrections do work to ensure that people either have access to identification, state ID, as well as, I believe, vital records as well. So a birth certificate or social security card prior to release. So that is something that's lead up. And as we know, vital records are so important in terms of access to education and employment. So I have a question, and I want to kick it off with Scott. Knowing just the work that you guys are moving forward with, clean slate and other policies that would mitigate some of the barriers to work, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced or know as an agency doing this work to enacting some of the policies that could reduce barriers to education, employment, career advancement for people with criminal records?
Good question, Erica, and the plug was well deserved. I've enjoyed looking through the playbook, and when you talk about barriers and the challenges, just want to share real quick. When I was a probation officer, I hate to admit it, but I was unaware of the actual number and the different types of barriers. Josh mentioned about self-employment as a great path for persons with criminal backgrounds, and I recommended many individuals to start their own business without knowing all these different barriers from occupational and professional licensing. So, in hindsight, it was probably bad advice, or it was advice that should have come with a few caveats to let them know what the barriers were going to be. I think that's important because we saw in our employer forums where we gathered all the different people in the communities together, the direct workers, the people in the trenches, the policy people. And what we realized, someone said we were preaching to the choir because in the initial stages, we did not get a lot of employers. But, as choirs go, they have to practice. So in the beginning, I think it was great practice for our choirs to understand what these barriers are, so that we can address them more on a unified, collaborative approach. And I think by CSG's playbook, it really gives a great guideline and an outside overview. And those of us that are here on the ground can pick up the torch and run with it. So, but getting back to your challenges, in 2017, as part of our overall 10 bill Justice Reinvestment Initiative, we had Act 262. And the byline on that act sounds great. It says, streamline the process for people with criminal convictions to apply for and receive occupational licenses. And from when you go through the text, the law looks great. It is a great pathway. But then, as Josh mentioned, there's over 24 boards that scrambled is almost an understatement. They lined up at committee hearing to be excluded from this legislation. And the law requires boards to submit annual reports to the House Committee on Commerce each year, including documentation of the number of licenses issued and denied, including all the reasons for these denials. And this applies even to those 24 boards that were excluded. I did a public records request, and there was only 3 reports from these 24 agencies or licensing boards in 2 years. So either they're not following, they're exempted, but they're not following the provision for oversight and transparency. And that was one of the goals in your playbook, was to promote transparency about how these convictions impact, but how the process goes. And hopefully we're looking forward to this session of taking the hard work CSG has done and having the legislature take a deeper dive into these almost 800, and if you narrow it down a little more, 300 barriers, and why are all these boards trying to be exempted, and why can't we get more transparency in this process? I think they need a little more understanding, and maybe we need to step up and give a little more explanation of how this law will can positively affect their industries, and not be a negative portion to it. And we also have by Representative Carpenter this session, House Bill 106, which is a collateral consequences bill, but at the time of plea, that the court would have to inform an individual, the defendant, of the potential consequences. It mentions education, housing, transportation, employment. And this is good for the individuals that are considering taking a plea, but I think it continues to remind all the actors in the criminal justice system that the consequences for these convictions far extend the assigned punishment by the courts. Whether it's 3 years of probation, it's going to be a lifelong traveling or journey with all these barriers. So the challenges are deeply entrenched, Erica, but I believe, over the past 3 or 4 years here in Louisiana and across the nation, there's been a big movement, a big push to start to include these individuals back into society, and to allow hope and redemption. Without hope and redemption, there's no one wants to move forward. I mean, that's how I get through my life is hope, and the fact that there's something to look forward
to. Thank you so much, Scott. And you highlighted some important pieces there. I mean, I had an opportunity in our team to look at the licensing for Ex-Offenders Act of 2017 that you spoke of. And like you said, good work done there. But when there are licensing boards who are excluded from participation, it doesn't make it as robustful and impactful as it could be. I wanted to ask Josh, a question, because, Josh shared a bit about what Louisiana is doing. They have, fair chance state employment, fair chance licensing, just expungement laws and a number of other things. And I'm just interested in knowing from you, Josh, are there states that are doing some work around occupational licensing or other, policies that mitigate some of the collateral consequences of having a criminal conviction?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And states are doing a lot, and they have a lot of that work has been started very recently, and they've had a lot of success, specifically around fair chance licensing. Now over 30 states in the country have really, robust, not perfect, but pretty robust fair chance licensing laws that effectively, provide guidance to occupational licensing bodies, telling them how convictions have to be considered. They say things like you can't consider any conviction that's not directly related to the license or activity. And then the law usually provides a number of steps for analysis to figure out whether something is directly related. What was the nature of the offense? How long ago did it happen? How old were you when it happened? Has the person been rehabilitated? All of these, really important factors. And it's not just about giving licensing bodies the tools to make those decisions and do them consistently and transparently. That's part of it, but it's also about arming applicants with the knowledge to kind of pursue these opportunities, knowing what they're getting into, knowing what they'll have to overcome, knowing what they'll have to prove about their background. And when we talk about licensing, and really when we talk about employment generally, this idea of deterrence is really, really significant. Because as much as we talk about these barriers and, oh my gosh, there's so many of them, and that's true to a point, absolutely. And many of them don't make a whole lot of sense on their face. But that sends, creates an idea out there in the reentering community that there are no opportunities. So I think it's important to highlight the opportunities that do exist. And I think it's important also, and other states have done this, and pardon my dog if you can hear him, but they have created opportunities for people to find out before they put in the hard work whether they'll be eligible for something. So there are now about 20 states that have, in the licensing context, a process where before you go to barber school or whatever training it is you need for an occupational license, you could ask the licensing board, you can say, hey, here's my criminal record. Am I going to be able to get this license? And that's huge for people because think about the time, the resources, all of that you have to invest, right, into getting the qualifications for the job. And you show up at the licensing board and they say, oh, sorry, that conviction. And you had no way of knowing, right? So, increasing transparency is huge. Also, talked a little bit about the expungement issue, making that more accessible, no matter how sort of how open expungement is in terms of what offenses are eligible, waiting periods. The uptake numbers are just incredibly low because you have to jump through so many hoops to get that relief. In Louisiana, it's even worse because filing fees can be over $500. That's just your court costs. If you want to get a lawyer to help you navigate, that's a whole other thing on top of that. So, automatic expungement is huge. It's started very recently. Pennsylvania's had success with that. Michigan, California, Utah, New Jersey, they all have automatic expungement laws now, and they're working on implementing those. It's a big task, but it really seems like the benefits are going to outweigh the costs in the long term, at least. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this briefly, is if you're going to allow people to expunge their records, ostensibly to create opportunities, right, that wouldn't be there otherwise, make sure that expungement has the effect of expanding opportunities. And that's not the case in all states. Louisiana is among the states where it's really just, you can't go to the courthouse and get your record. That's what expungement means. There are very few prohibitions on what people can ask about your criminal conviction if it's been expunged, or how they can be considered if they get it. And a lot of states now, North Carolina, where I am, has been really good about this, have all of these provisions in their expungement law, what it means for an employer, for a licensing board, for a person with an expunged conviction once they get that expungement. And so that's really important. And there's a lot that could be learned there from the other states. Just to name a few things. I know we're limited on time.
Yeah, and Josh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's so good for folks to hear about, what else can we do? How do we push the needle a little further and learn what other states are doing to do this work, and how they can develop model policies to support access to employment and careers. We're almost at time. We got about 4 minutes left in the session, and I want to remind folks to please enter in questions into the chat box on your screen. We can, take questions that you have for the panelists, and we've been trying to answer your questions as you are dropping them into the chat box. And while we wait for the questions to come in, maybe I'll turn it back over to Amy, because I just think, again, being able to access the training and education is such a key piece of this work. And, finances could be an issue. So Amy, and just maybe a quick 1 or 2 minutes, it'll be great to hear about, how your agency is preparing for the reinstatement of Pell for those who, are behind the fence. And I believe that initiative is called Justice Pell Reinstatement, but please correct me if it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think funding is key, and I think it's really important to kind of know all of the different funding opportunities that you have. So, and thinking out of the context of my own pocket, right? So how can we tap into those different pots of money like WIOA or SNAP ENT for education and training? And then Title IV funds, such as the federal Pell Grant, that I think is going to be the greatest area that we're going to be able to capitalize on. In the current environment, we are very limited in how we use the Pell Grant dollar, particularly for individuals who are incarcerated. And this removal is now going to really open up a lot of opportunity for the colleges to utilize the federal Pell Grant to provide funding, to provide even more educational training programs that we have today. And so to that point, at the national level, so I'm a part of the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. We're working as a working group to really kind of look at the process for obtaining financial aid from a very holistic approach and very 360 degrees. So how do you admit and apply? And then, other issues like accreditation and MOUs with the prison system. So really trying to look at it at that standpoint. And then I'm also a part of a working group at LCTCS in particular. And we're really just trying to prepare ourselves for when this goes live. So it passed in December of 2020. The Department of Ed can implement this as early as July they can implement it early, but the tentative date could be by July of 2023. But we're hoping for an earlier implementation. And I think we're kind of leaning towards July of 2020. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed. And that is the date that we're really striving towards. And that working group is really trying to look at, what do we need to have in place so that we can further educate individuals? So do we have to have MOUs? What type of training programs are going to be approved? What are the reporting mechanisms that we need to have in place? Do we have data sharing agreements so that we are able to provide that information? How do we get access to prisons? Do we need case management? So there's a lot of challenges, I think, that we're tackling right now. And I think we have a lot of time so that we're able to kind of knock those off as much as we possibly can. And, we're just really excited. I will say that LCTCS, we were really involved in, the prison system for a while. We have kind of stepped back a little bit, primarily to funding. And this is going to just give us a reinvigorated effort to really get back into the prison system to provide additional training. And I really want us to focus a lot on really making that connection between, leaving prison and re-entering their community so that they can have connections with colleges when they get back, when they re-enter their community. We want them to continue their education, further on. So super excited about all the work that we're doing here in Louisiana around that.
And thank you so much. I think that was a great ending to today's panel discussion. I just want to take a moment and just, thank Scott Payton just for sharing his expertise and how much he has, along with his agency, Right on Crime, put work and effort into moving the needle with regards to removing barriers to education and work and careers for people with criminal records. I want to thank Dr. Amy Campbell. You heard from her. They're eager, they're willing to provide training and education. They're doing it behind the fence. They're doing it in the community. And there's a number of initiatives that are underway that can support education and continued education for those with criminal records. Also want to thank my colleague, Josh Gaines. As you can see, there is a lot going on in Louisiana with regards to mitigating some of the barriers to accessing education, employment, and careers, but there's still more work to be done. And as he shared in the end of his question that I recently proposed to him, there are some strategies that states are adopting that Louisiana can look to adopt as well. I want to thank Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections for putting this panel together and working with us along the way in the planning. The Return for Good initiative is underway, and I believe in the chat you've seen the new website that has been posted and doing this work. I want to thank all the attendees who participated in today's session. I hope that you have learned quite a bit, and this has motivated you to go out to your legislators, go out to your education institutions, go out to your advocacy and other organizations to say, we need to do more. What can be done? How can I help? Again, just thanking everyone who participated today. I hope this information was helpful to you. And please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists to ask more questions. Also in the chat for Return for Good, you can reach out to Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections to learn more about this initiative and the work moving forward. Have a wonderful, wonderful morning and afternoon for others who are on the East Coast, and look forward to continuing the work. Thank you.
Thank you.